So this is all very well and good, isn't it? You should just be able to sort of go off on a mountaintop or sit in your office with the door closed and discover the 7 pillars of insight, right? Right? No? Well, what are we missing? Feedback. Let me give you an example. So about a year ago, I was deep into this self-awareness research program. And my husband and I, and about 6 of our friends, decided that we were going to go on a night on the town. And we went to the Vesta Dipping Grill, if you just want to picture it in your mind, my Colorado crowd. So we're having a great night. The check came. We didn't want to go home. And I should also tell you that I was driving my husband and I home that night, so I was not partaking in the copious amounts of alcohol that were being consumed. So everybody was thrilled. We actually went to a bar just a couple blocks away, and we all sat down and we pushed our high-top tables together. And my friend Teresa sat next to me, and I just adore her. And so we were talking, and I could tell everybody had been drinking. And she sort of dreamily looked at me and she said, "Tasha, I am so glad that Dave brought you into our lives 10 years ago when you first started dating." And I said, "Oh, Teresa, that's so nice." And before I could even say that, she said something that shook me to my very core. She said, and I quote, "Boy, have you come a long way since I first met you." So I said, "How very illuminating." And I asked a few questions, and I'll spare you the details, mostly for my pride. I learned that at age 26, when I first met my husband, I was insufferably arrogant. Insufferably arrogant. So we're driving home, and I'm sort of, in my head, and I decided that as a self-awareness researcher, I was going to need to explore this. So I said, "Dave, Teresa said something to me, and I wanted to kind of get your reaction." She basically said that when we first met, I was kind of full of myself. Dead silence next to me. Yeah, right, smart man. But as we'll learn, we should tell each other the truth. So I did appreciate what he said. So the first question he asked was, "Is this a trick question?" I said, no, it's not a trick question. And he said, "Well," and then he started to think of examples. He was regaling me with examples. One of them was when I arrived at the company that we both worked at, where we met, all of my peers had offices. And so I decided that I, too, was entitled to an office. And he said, "That was a little over the top." And I said, "Wow. To me, it was a quest for justice. But the impact I was having on the people around me, that was not what was being communicated." The robo-investors are taking over, right? The commoditization of investment management is happening. And what I argue is that one of the ways you can out-human those robo-investors is self-awareness. So it's not just you. It's not just having to understand who you are, how you're perceived by your company, what kind of culture you're creating. It's also about instilling that feeling, that expertise in people, in the people that work for you. And the reason is, robo-investors can't compete with that. If every single person in your company is connecting with your customers on a deep, personal level, there's no competition, right? So for each of you, what I'd ask is, are your people ready, willing, and able to do that? I came across a study recently that said 74% of financial advisors see their customers as increasingly wanting more general life support beyond just helping them pick numbers. And if you're like a lot of my clients in this world, you didn't go into business to hold people's hands, right? Or be their life coach. But whether you like it or not, that is what the expectation is growing to become. So how do you compete with that? So as I mentioned earlier, I've spent the last 3 years of my life deeply researching this topic of self-awareness. And the reason that I'm so incredibly passionate about it is that over the last 15 years in my career as an organizational psychologist, I've found that even if they didn't start out that way, the leaders, and particularly executives, who did the work
to understand who they are, what their values are, what they're passionate about, what their goals are, and understand how they're seen by their people are always more successful, and thus the meta skill of the 21st century. But I'll tell you something. In the world of management, how many of you have heard the term self-awareness tossed around before? You've heard it tossed around right in the last 20 minutes. And that's common. And I think it's because it's a critically important skill. But what I noticed was a lack of rigor of examining this topic. It was often a footnote, right? People would say, oh, and by the way, you have to be more self-aware. You have to do a better job of reflecting on your strengths and weaknesses, or you have to get feedback. But I had a feeling that it wasn't that simple. And indeed, it wasn't. And I'll tell you more about what I discovered. There are financial consequences to an executive's lack of self-awareness. Number one data point is executives who are out of touch with reality about themselves, their strengths and weaknesses, and so on, are 6 times more likely to derail. What's especially interesting in my research is I've found that, in particular, many CEOs who become somewhat delusional don't always start out that way. So you think about this series of forces, right? You have a more visible role. More people see your decisions. There's infinitely more complexity in what you're doing every day. And the standards for performance are murkier. Now, the interesting thing about Oscar Munoz, the United CEO, is if you look at the sum total of his decisions, you could argue, and I might be alone in this, but I have done the work to look into it, you could argue that he's made some very strong decisions so far. But the 2 press releases, or the 2 statements that went out about him, were so dripping with a lack of self-awareness that it had immense consequences to their bottom line and their reputation. Now, the good news is I think he's on the right path. And in some ways, and you can tell me if I'm right in a year, this might be one of the best things that's ever happened to United in terms of getting it back on a course to actually respond to the needs of their customers and their environment. But one CEO's lack of self-awareness was what set this off. What I'm going to do, we'll do it 3 times, is I'll flash something on the screen, and I want you to self-assess how you're doing on that particular thing. Make sense? All right, let's dive in. Job knowledge. In your job knowledge, are you below average, average, or above average? Everyone got an idea? All right, so raise your hand if you place yourself at average in job knowledge. Okay, what about below average? No one? Not a single person? What about above average? Good, okay. So 50-50 or so, we'll call it. What kind of a friend are you? How many of you think that you are an average friend? What about below average? None, not a single one? This is statistically impossible. What about above average? Yay. No one wants to say, I'm an average friend, do they? All right, last but not least, this one can get kind of contentious. I'm always scared to drive on the East Coast, personally. How many are below average drivers? Oh, wow, look at that, okay. Maybe there's some regional differences here. What about average? What about above average? Okay. Now, what was the pattern or the trends that we just saw? There is a phenomenon in psychology called, quite fittingly, the above average effect. And what the research on this shows us is that most people feel that they are smarter, better at work, better friends, better drivers, better leaders than they objectively are. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you're wrong, but it does mean that human beings in general tend to see themselves with rose-colored glasses. How many of you know one of those people? that has a delusional sense of their own significance. How many of you have dated one of those people? Oh yes, support group, right? Here's a very interesting data point, I think. Research has shown that the least competent people are the most confident about their abilities and their performance. I'm going to say that again. The least competent people are the most confident about their abilities and performance. What percentage of people do you believe see themselves as self-aware? Any guesses? 80? Good guess. Anyone higher? 85? Okay, prepare to be amazed. This is according to my research. This isn't a number I pulled out of the air. It's based on surveys of thousands of people. 95% of people think they're self-aware. Okay, the next question is what? How many are? So any guesses? What percentage of people actually are, according to my research, self-aware? Oh, you guys are close. It's a little lower. Interesting, 10 to 15%. So the above average effect is at play here, isn't it? Now, if you're like me, if I was sitting in the audience hearing about this for the first time, what I would be sitting there thinking is, well, that may very well be. But I'm definitely in that 10 to 15%. The bottom line is self-awareness, unfortunately, is not our default state. And the people who spend time and energy honing this meta skill of the 21st century will reap the rewards, plain and simple. That's why it's the #1 step in becoming more awesome. So there's a great quote from a writer named Marianne Williamson. And she says it takes courage to endure the sharp pains of self-discovery, then choose the dull pain of unconsciousness that would last the rest of our lives. Really powerful. So here's what I want you to start thinking about, starting right now. Am I going to keep my rose-colored glasses on and just say above average, above average, above average? Or am I going to try to see myself even more clearly? Am I going to continue on that path? Or am I going to take the time to become what I call braver but wiser? Braver but wiser. And probably out of all the things I'm going to tell you today, this is the most important. Strong, confident, beautiful. A lot of people in the month or so since my book has come out have sent me messages, or they've tweeted me, and they've said, I'm really excited to read your book, or I'm really excited to learn about self-awareness, but I am terrified. And I can completely sympathize with that. I think it's hard to make that choice, right? It takes energy, it takes courage. And that dull pain of unconsciousness is even worse. But here's what I want to tell you. Here's what's on the other side of that journey. And again, I'll give you a couple of tools in a second. People who are more self-aware holistically see themselves. They see themselves clearly for who they are and how they're seen. They understand their gifts. And by the way, becoming more self-aware, I think you'll have more positive surprises than negative surprises. They know what they're great at. They know what they're not so great at. And they compassionately look at themselves and practice forgiveness and grace and don't expect themselves to be perfect. So think about this. If you could know yourself 10% better, what kind of an impact would that have on your career and your life in general? It would really have a huge impact. So I want you to look at this holy grail, this up and to the right on that graph before, as a positive, confidence-building activity. Every once in a while, you are going to not like what you hear. Plain and simple, right? As I learned with my friend Teresa. But no matter what, you're going to have the information you need to control your destiny.